Machamp is not born powerful. Most of them never become Machamp at all. Their bodies collapse long before they mature, crushed by pressures their own skeletons cannot yet survive. The ones that do endure emerge as four-armed mass engines capable of moving loads that would shear steel supports and fracture concrete. But this strength is not cosmetic. In the shattered mountain systems they inhabit, Machamp function as load-bearing organisms, stabilizing unstable cliff networks and redirecting rockfall through controlled movement. Remove them, and entire slopes destabilize. Valleys fill. Habitats vanish. To understand Machamp is to understand what happens when evolution builds a creature not to dominate an environment, but to physically hold it together. Machamp are not born into these mountains. They are engineered by them. And that process begins in only one kind of place. Machamp do not reproduce in gentle valleys or sheltered forests. They breed exclusively in Ironcliff zones, harsh regions defined by collapsed mining tunnels, ferrous cliff bands, and unstable tectonic seams where the ground itself is in constant violent motion. These are not arbitrary preferences. The species requires gravitational and mechanical loading from the earliest embryonic stages. Eggs are deposited in rock crevices, subjected to continuous vibration, minor seismic shifts, and compressive microstresses that would destroy the developing offspring of any other species known to science. This environmental input begins shaping connective tissue density before hatching even occurs. Offspring born outside these zones consistently fail to develop proper skeletal rigidity. Their bones grow porous, joints remain dangerously loose, and muscular attachments never achieve full integration with the surrounding framework. The Ironcliff environment is not a preference. It is a biological prerequisite encoded into the species at the cellular level. The crushing weight and relentless tremor of these unstable mountain ranges are the only forces capable of triggering the developmental cascades that produce a viable Machop. But these forces do not create strength. At first, they mostly create death. A newly hatched Machop is a fragile, dangerously unfinished thing. Its skeleton exists as a lattice of calcium scaffolding rather than solid bone, designed for rapid remodeling but extremely vulnerable to sudden mechanical stress. Falls from even moderate heights can shatter developing limbs entirely. Excessive torsion during climbing tears connective sheaths away from their bone anchor points. Overexertion during basic foraging activities causes microfractures that compound into catastrophic structural failure within days or weeks. Early mortality rates exceed 60% in most observed populations, with some particularly unstable regions recording losses approaching 80% during seismically active years. The survivors are not the strongest or the boldest. They are the most cautious. Juveniles that instinctively limit their load exposure, resting frequently and avoiding unstable surfaces entirely, allow their skeletal lattice adequate time to calcify between stress events. Those that push too hard, too fast, break before they ever mature. Natural selection in these unforgiving ranges does not favor aggression or ambition. It favors restraint and careful self-preservation. Only the patient survive long enough to reach adolescence intact. So, survival does not come from getting stronger. It comes from learning how not to break. Surviving juveniles do not roam freely across the ranges. They cannot afford to. Each young Machop establishes a micro-territory no larger than a few dozen square meters, typically a narrow ledge system, a friction-rich boulder field, or a shallow stone basin where movement remains tightly controlled and entirely predictable. These constrained environments provide carefully graduated resistance without unexpected variables. The juvenile climbs the same surfaces, lifts the same stones, and navigates the same familiar obstacles repeatedly across weeks and months of continuous development. This repetition is not wasted energy. It is calibrated conditioning. Every repeated motion reinforces bone density along specific stress lines where force concentrates. Every controlled strain strengthens tendon insertion points where failure would be immediately catastrophic. Juveniles that wander prematurely into unfamiliar terrain face unpredictable loads their incomplete bodies cannot safely absorb. A novel climbing angle or an unexpected surface texture can exceed tolerance thresholds with lethal consequences. The micro-territory functions as a biological training facility, a space where growth occurs safely because the variables remain constant and survivable. Expansion beyond these boundaries comes only after the skeleton solidifies enough to tolerate novelty and uncertainty. But repetition is only preparation. Eventually, the body begins rebuilding itself around the loads it has memorized. As the juvenile matures toward adolescence, its skeletal architecture undergoes radical reorganization that reshapes the entire body plan. The porous lattice framework begins filling with dense calcium phosphate deposits, converting flexible scaffolding into rigid load-bearing columns capable of resisting forces that would shatter ordinary bone. But density alone cannot support what this species must eventually become in maturity. Secondary joint structures emerge at the shoulder girdle, allowing independent articulation across what will become multiple limb pairs. The spine thickens dramatically and segments into reinforced sections, distributing compressive forces across a broader vertical axis rather than concentrating dangerous stress at single vulnerable vertebrae. Connective tissues reorganize into layered sheaths capable of absorbing shock without tearing away from anchor points. The clavicle complex expands laterally, widening the torso substantially to anchor the additional musculature that will follow in subsequent developmental stages. This transformation is not seamless or painless. Growth spurts create temporary misalignments that compromise mobility. Joints lock unexpectedly or hyperextend beyond safe ranges. The body is rebuilding itself while still functioning, a dangerous process that claims even late-stage juveniles who encounter excessive strain during vulnerable remodeling windows. Only those who reach full lattice integration without catastrophic failure proceed towards the next threshold. Even reinforced bone is not enough. Without a new way to distribute force, this body would still destroy itself. Bone alone cannot generate the force this species requires for survival. The true transformation occurs when the muscular system reorganizes into segmented, synchronized layers capable of coordinated multi-limb output. In early developmental stages, muscle fibers run in simple parallel bundles attached to single skeletal anchor points. As Machoke transitions toward its final adult form, these bundles separate into distinct functional groups, each responsible for different vectors of force output and stabilization. The forearms of a mature Machamp do not operate as simple duplicates performing identical motions in parallel. They operate as coordinated subsystems working in concert, with deeper muscle layers stabilizing the torso against rotational forces, while superficial groups execute powerful movements at the limb extremities. This segmentation prevents the catastrophic internal shear that would otherwise destroy the body during maximal exertion. When all four limbs exert force simultaneously against a resistant load, the stress does not concentrate at the spinal column. It distributes across interlocking muscle chains that absorb, redirect, and dissipate mechanical energy before it reaches vulnerable skeletal junctions. Spinal collapse, the leading cause of death in malformed or prematurely developed adults, becomes mechanically impossible once full segmentation completes throughout the body. The body has transformed into a distributed system, a coordinated network rather than a single vulnerable column. But a machine like this creates a new danger, not mechanical failure, energy failure. A body capable of continuous high-load output requires an energy system powerful enough to match its extraordinary mechanical demands. Adult Machamp physiology locks into a metabolic state that would destroy lesser organisms within hours of activation. Caloric throughput increases nearly fivefold compared to juvenile stages, requiring constant foraging and consumption throughout waking hours. Oxygen uptake efficiency reaches levels comparable to the most extreme high-altitude migratory species known to researchers. The vascular system expands dramatically, delivering fuel to deep muscle tissue faster than lactate and metabolic waste products can accumulate. But sustained exertion at this intensity generates enormous quantities of heat. Without aggressive thermal regulation, core temperature would rise to lethal thresholds within minutes of heavy labor cooking the creature from inside. Dense vascular beds beneath the skin surface function as radiator arrays, venting excess heat through exposed dermal tissue into the surrounding air. Respiration cycles synchronize with exertion rhythms, expelling superheated air in precisely timed bursts that prevent dangerous thermal accumulation. This metabolic lock-in is irreversible once triggered. The creature cannot return to low-output dormancy states. It must keep moving, keep working, keep burning fuel constantly or risk systemic collapse. All of this power is meaningless if it cannot be controlled. And in the mountains, control decides everything. Machamp do not merely tolerate difficult terrain, they dominate it completely. Adult locomotion incorporates all four limbs in continuous contact sequences, distributing body weight across multiple anchor points at all times regardless of surface angle or overall stability. On sheer cliff faces, where other creatures would certainly fall, two arms maintain secure grip while two reposition, creating a fluid vertical crawl that never fully commits body weight to any single hold. On unstable slopes prone to sudden shifting, the lower limbs widen stance automatically, while upper arms counterbalance dynamically against lateral movement. The body reads terrain through constant micro-adjustments, detecting surface integrity through pressure feedback before committing dangerous levels of force. This is not consciously learned behavior acquired through trial and error. It is the physiological culmination of a lifetime spent navigating environments where a single misstep triggers fatal consequences. Balance is not simply maintained through static positioning. It is continuously recalculated across four independent limb systems operating in parallel coordination throughout every movement. The result is a creature capable of scaling vertical surfaces that would defeat any climbing machine and traversing unstable terrain that collapses under lesser distributed weight. But when something this heavy moves through a mountain, the mountain begins to change. Despite their absolute mastery of vertical terrain, adult Machamp do not range freely across the mountains. They maintain clearly defined territories spanning several square kilometers each, and they enforce physical separation from neighboring individuals with deliberate and consistent effort throughout the year. This is not aggression or resource competition in the traditional sense. It is infrastructure management on a geological scale. A single adult Machamp exerts enough sustained mechanical pressure on cliff systems to measurably alter load distribution across entire rock faces over time. Two adults operating in close proximity would compound these effects dangerously, accelerating erosion patterns, destabilizing dormant fault lines, and triggering collapse events that neither individual could survive regardless of their immense strength. Territorial zoning prevents cumulative mechanical stress from exceeding geological stability thresholds. Boundary enforcement is conducted through low-intensity signaling, postural displays, and strategic presence rather than direct physical combat. Actual fights between fully developed adults risk destroying the very terrain both depend upon for continued survival. The mountain can only carry so much weight concentrated in one area. They understand this instinctively and behave accordingly. And this risk reaches its peak at the only moment the species cannot afford failure. Machamp do not breed opportunistically whenever resources happen to allow. Reproduction occurs only during extended periods of seismic and atmospheric stability, when the Ironcliff zones experience minimal tectonic activity and predictable weather patterns across multiple consecutive seasons. These carefully selected windows allow newly hatched offspring to complete critical early skeletal conditioning before environmental chaos returns to the ranges. If juveniles are exposed to extreme load events or seismic disruption before their lattice formation stabilizes adequately, mortality approaches total loss of the entire clutch. Adults assess environmental stability through accumulated sensory cues gathered over many months of patient observation, delaying reproduction entirely when tremor frequency increases or erosion patterns suggest imminent instability approaching. A single mistimed breeding cycle can eliminate an entire generation from a local population. The species trades reproductive volume and frequency for developmental security, producing fewer offspring overall, but investing longer stable environmental windows into each individual offspring. Survival at every single life stage demands patience above all else, because Machamp are not only shaped by the mountains. Over time, the mountains become shaped by them. Fully mature Machamp do not simply inhabit the Ironcliff ranges as passive residents. They actively maintain them through constant interaction. Their continuous movement across unstable terrain redistributes accumulated mass, compacts loose substrate before it becomes dangerous, and reinforces weakened rock faces through repeated controlled load application. Boulders perched in positions that would eventually trigger cascading rockfalls are shifted to stable configurations. Developing fracture lines are compressed through applied pressure before they can propagate into catastrophic failures. The mountain breathes and stabilizes because they move constantly across it. In regions where Machamp populations have collapsed due to human interference or habitat destruction, cliff systems deteriorate with alarming speed. Erosion accelerates beyond natural rates. Rockfall frequency increases dramatically. Entire mountain slopes fail catastrophically within decades rather than centuries. They are not merely apex survivors of an extreme environment. They are geological engineers, living infrastructure holding the high places together against the forces that would tear them down.